We live in a world that actively conditions men to seek comfort, to blend into the safety of the pack, and to prioritize immediate security over ultimate purpose. But leadership, true sovereign leadership, is fundamentally unnatural. It requires a specific psychological blueprint that we call the lion mentality. The tragedy is that 99% of men will fail this test. They fail not because they lack talent or ambition, but because they mistake the temporary comfort of the herd for true survival. They collapse the moment the external support structures vanish and the brutal reality of isolation sets in. You are rapidly running out of time to decide which side of the statistic you belong to. You can either continue to play a finite game of seeking superficial approval, or you can awaken the primal, unyielding standard within you, accept the heavy burden of the apex leader, and refuse to let your potential be diluted by a culture that rewards mediocrity. A man's psychological wiring naturally craves the safety and validation of the collective pack. For centuries, blending into the crowd meant survival, creating a deeply ingrained fear of standing entirely alone. Yet the tragic paradox is that this intense drive for social conformity systematically destroys a man's primal sovereignty. By prioritizing the consensus of the herd, he actively dilutes his unique strength. True alpha leadership demands a fundamental break from this collective mindset, forcing a man to risk external rejection to discover internal certainty. The 99% who fail this test do so because they trade their ultimate purpose for immediate security. The position at the very top of any domain inherently demands a psychological price that few men are truly prepared to pay. When a man ascends to the apex, he enters a vacuum where the comforting safety net of shared responsibility completely evaporates. This absolute isolation is the inescapable tax of ruling your environment, a mental landscape where high-stakes decisions must be forged entirely alone. Most men fail this test because they lack the internal framework to endure such a profound silence. They misinterpret the loneliness of leadership as a design flaw rather than a structural necessity, desperately reaching backward for the warm validation of the crowd. A man's capacity to lead is fundamentally bottlenecked by his deep psychological need for external permission. From an early age, modern systems condition men to wait for a green light, looking to peers or authorities for validation before taking a decisive step. The lion mentality demands that a man breaks free from this paralyzing loop, recognizing that the apex predator never waits for a consensus to begin the hunt. Shifting your internal framework to execute autonomously means becoming completely accountable for your own trajectory. The 99% fail because they cannot sustain momentum when the external instructions disappear. The human brain is evolutionarily wired to prioritize immediate survival over the uncertain promise of a distant legacy. For most men, the survival matrix operates as an invisible trap, whispering that a predictable routine and social acceptance are the ultimate markers of a successful life. This biological craving for short-term security quietly erodes a man's deep potential, conditioning him to fear the very risks required to achieve true greatness. The 99% fail the test of leadership because they optimize for immediate comfort rather than enduring the friction of growth. When faced with the high-stakes danger of the unknown, their internal psychology defaults to protective mechanisms. They willingly trade away their ultimate destiny just to stay safe within the prison of the status quo. A man's structural capacity as a leader is directly proportional to the amount of psychological friction he is willing to navigate. Just as physical muscle requires microscopic tears to grow stronger, a man's mental architecture demands intense internal resistance to calibrate its true threshold of resilience. Most men misinterpret psychological pain as a signal to stop, treating discomfort as a sign of failure rather than a biological indicator of growth. When he actively avoids this necessary friction, his internal capacity remains inherently fragile, leaving him fundamentally ill-equipped for the heavy burdens of leadership. And during the deep isolation of this internal crucible is how the alpha mindset separates itself from the 99% who break under pressure. When the weight of responsibility feels crushing and external validation hits zero, the true test of a man's character begins. This intense calibration process strips away superficial motivations, forcing him to discover an unshakable purpose that operates entirely independent of his environment. By leaning directly into the pain instead of retreating to comfort, he builds the deep emotional reserves required to anchor his tribe. A man's ultimate legacy is not measured by the power he wields over others, but by the safety and certainty he provides for those who depend on him. In our evolutionary history, the primary function of the leader was never to eat first, but to face danger first. True authority is not demanded, it is willingly granted by the tribe to the individual who demonstrates an unshakable standard of behavior when everything is falling apart. The 99% of men who fail this psychological test do so because they mistake leadership for dominance, pursuing superficial status rather than the heavy responsibility of protection. When a man shifts his internal focus from self-preservation to building an ecosystem of trust, his daily discipline transforms into a structural pillar for everyone around him. Architecting a lasting legacy requires an intentional decision to hold the line on your core principles precisely when it is most inconvenient to do so. It is easy to maintain high standards when the environment is cooperative, but the true test of authority happens during the moments of profound crisis. When the pressure mounts and the temptation to compromise integrity becomes overwhelming, the leader with a lion mentality stands firm as an unyielding shield for his pack. He understands that an enduring standard is built by the behavior he models under intense duress. By willingly absorbing the external friction and enduring the heavy cost of isolation, he creates a concrete blueprint of resilience that empowers the next generation to step away from the crowd.